Hello from St. Albert, Alberta, Canada. Here to discuss the overall concept of harmonization in codes and its particular history and application in Canada. My name is Kevan Jess. I am coming up on my 40th anniversary in the fire service. That 10 years of that as a volunteer, followed by another 17 years as a fire investigator, fire inspector, and then served as the chief fire administrator and then the fire commissioner for the province of Alberta. And I currently consult in Alberta for a company called Behr Integrated Solutions. So my purpose here today is just to highlight some of the successes and challenges that we've gone through in the Canadian code system over the years. First of all, I should probably describe the Canadian government system. Canada is what would be referred to as a federated parliamentary democracy. The federal government has a certain set of responsibilities, as do each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories. And there are some additional expectations and responsibilities placed on organizations like federal departments and First Nations chiefs and councils. So those all play a role in this. Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution Act of Canada, which is formerly known as the British North America Act, lays out the responsibilities for the federal and provincial governments, and codes and property, or codes through the extension of the responsibility for property rights in Canada, fall on the provinces. So we have no one national legislative mandate for the adoption and enforcement of building codes, fire codes, mechanical codes, etc. They all are adopted on a province by province basis, in contrast to the criminal law in Canada, which is exclusively federal in jurisdiction. The federal government lays out the requirements in the criminal code, or the things that one shall not do. Otherwise, you would be guilty of a crime and subject to fine, incarceration, or both. Provinces certainly have a lot of regulatory room to operate in, that they deal with health, education, as I mentioned before, property rights, municipal and local matters, which makes things a little bit interesting when we try and put a national code system in place. So in Canada, we have an organization known as National Research Council, which is an arm of an agency of the federal government, and an organization within that, because National Research Council has a much broader mandate than just codes and standards. A Codes Canada division, which looks after the development of primarily the National Building Code of Canada, then the National Fire Code of Canada, the National Plumbing Code of Canada, and the National Energy Code for buildings. Those documents are created by Codes Canada as model codes for provinces and to a certain extent territories to adopt, as well as the federal government and First Nations councils. Those model codes, however, don't have any force and effect until one of those organizations is to sit down and adopt by regulation that particular document. And in Canada, we have those 13 provinces and territories in particular that are all at varying stages of adopting that code. And in addition to that, the federal government, as I mentioned before, has some properties and responsibilities that it deals with, that it has to have a means to adopt the code. So typically through Treasury Board directive, organizations like the Department of National Defense, Public Works Canada, and to a certain extent, First Nations that have not directly adopted their own codes are covered by the federal government's adoption of a code through Treasury Board order. The rest require regulations to be passed by the appropriate executive council and or legislature, depending on the individual province involved. So we have a bit of a mishmash, if you wish. So the National Building Code of Canada was first created in 1941, primarily through the impetus of the requirements that came out of Canada's entry into the Second World War in 1939. In 1941, the National Building Code of Canada was put in place to standardize and create a specific level of safety and quality, particularly for those facilities which were being constructed for the war effort. The one that seems most prevalent in my part of the country in Alberta is the work that was done for the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, creation of airfields and hangars and barracks in smaller centers all across mainly southern and central Alberta, from places like Lethbridge, Claresholm, Fort Macleod, High River, Vulcan. So those all were built or intended to be built under the National Building Code of Canada in 1941. Following that, most provinces played or didn't play with, but recognized the National Building Code of Canada, and but the municipalities were generally, for the most part, left with the option to include a building code if they wished in any municipal building bylaws and standards that the local council had put in place. And that continued for some time. In 1963, the National Research Council published the first National Fire Code of Canada. And that document basically, as I should probably back up a second here, as the building code speaks to structural performance, performance in climatic conditions for things such as wind load and snow load. The fire code was essentially designed to ensure that things that are hot don't come in contact with things that are burn, or essentially human behavior, as well as the overall expectation that the fire code would guide the maintenance of any fire protection or notification installations that were to be included within required by the National Building Code of Canada. So those two documents have evolved over time. The National Research Council, in its code development process, utilizes a broad-based matrix of people from across the country to assist in subcommittees dealing with, in this instance specifically, fire protection, use and egress of buildings, standing committee on housing and small buildings, and a standing committee on hazardous materials and activities, which is a standing committee that I sat on for a number of years in my previous positions. So those documents are often seen as the complementary piece to the National Building Code of Canada. Some people will refer to the building code as the construction document and the fire code as the maintenance document. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, there's also a National Plumbing Code of Canada, which is not my area of expertise, and a National Energy Code. So those documents, just to give you a history of how they came to be in this jurisdiction, the province of Alberta, in 1974, the province, through regulation at provincial cabinet or executive council, adopted what was then the National Building Code of Canada, with some local modifications and changes. Were very few local modifications and changes, and the document is quite thin because it refers back directly to the National Building Code of Canada. That process has continued and gradually evolved and broadened over time. Both the national code has gotten broader in scope. We'll talk about some of those, the reason for some of those things in a moment. But it's also gotten much bigger in its content. So in 78, then 1980, 1990, pardon me, and 1997, we had the Alberta Building Code, which was some derivation from the National Building Code of Canada. And those timeframes were fairly consistent with the Codes Canada, or NRC at the time, process of it revising and adopting a new building code, or National Building Code of Canada, not adopting, pardon me, publishing a National Building Code of Canada on a 5-year cycle. The end of the 1995 cycle, which the Alberta Code became the 1997 Alberta Building Code, making use of that 1995 National Building Code of Canada, an effort was made to change the code from its what was then purely prescriptive requirements for code. So if you were going to build one of these, or you wanted to operate one of these, or provide this particular occupancy, then here's the things that you must do. The requirements for structural integrity, the requirements for, as I mentioned before, climatic loads from wind, snow, rain, as well as the passive and active fire suppression and protection systems that one may need to put in a particular building based on what it was. So those things were all there. In 1995, efforts shortly following the publication of the 1995 National Code, both building and fire code, and I guess I should add here now, and it's a fairly short piece, but in 1984, the first provincial, or Alberta Fire Code, was created, following closely on the National Fire Code of Canada as that complementary one of two pieces of the puzzle to the Alberta Building Code. So that was published in 84. The next fire code was published in 1992, and then in 1997 it was published again in Alberta and adopted in the same time frame as the Alberta Building Code. So they've been in lockstep since 1997 from a timing perspective in Alberta. The next editions, just for reference, 2006, which is based on the 2005 National Building Code, 2014, which was based on the 2010 National Codes, and currently 2019, although the name is now changed to the National Building Code of Canada and the National Fire Code of Canada, Alberta Editions 2019. So that process has gone through and taken some time. And it's been sometimes painfully slow, it would seem, but it also has provided some significant opportunities to provide a more tailored and sophisticated approach to building regulation in Canada. The main accomplishment in the publication of the 2005 codes was to go from that purely strictly prescriptive process that had been in place previously and introduce the opportunity for alternative solutions utilizing objectives and functional statements to create alternative solutions, or what most of us will know as variances in legislation, that allow different things to happen, provided a equal or similar level of life and property safety was created by whatever the proponent's proposed alternative solution was. That process has, as I said, been in the code since 2005. In Alberta, that process was adopted under the Safety Codes Act, and the Safety Codes Act in Alberta specifically allows for and provides for the ability for owners to propose, and safety codes officers or inspectors in the broader parlance to review and accept an alternative solution or a variance for a particular concern. As you will note from the timeframes, none of this takes place quickly, and in late 2015, provincial government here in Alberta moved towards what we'll call timely, or some people will refer to as automatic adoption of codes. So with the title change of the Alberta Building Code and the Alberta Fire Code to the National Building and Fire Codes of Canada, Alberta Edition 2019, process is now in place for those codes to be automatically adopted within 12 months of the National Research Council publishing the next versions of the National Building Code of Canada, National Fire Code of Canada. Concurrently with all of that are the numbers of standards that are written into codes. Most standards in Canada, although certainly not all, will come from a Canadian Standards Development Organization, typically Underwriters Laboratories of Canada, or sometimes Underwriters Laboratories out of the States has some stuff, and we're working to harmonize those documents, or UL and ULC certainly are. The Canadian Standards Association, commonly known as CSA, which both UL and CSA have a worldwide footprint, as does the National Fire Protection Association, for where most of many of the fire protection standards that are within the building code and the fire code in Canada and Alberta take place. So those documents and their new pieces also have to fit into this updating and adoption process. So each province has adopted those codes on a different time frame, and they all have made their own additions as to what they believe to be a need within their jurisdiction for different things. As I mentioned before, Alberta currently works in the 2019 codes on the basis of the 2015 National Building and Fire Codes of Canada. We're currently awaiting the publication of the 2020 National Building Code and Fire Code of Canada, which will be followed within 12 months unless the minister deems otherwise, with a new edition of the Alberta Building Code, or the National Building Code of Canada, Alberta edition, and same with the Fire Code. So those things take place. Other provinces, my colleagues in other provinces work on codes that typically revert back to either the 2005 code. Many will have gotten to the 2010 code. Very few have adopted the 2015 code in any full format. So there's an ongoing process here of how can we harmonize when each of these jurisdictions has not only disparate timeframes, but also different ideas as to what should be in the code. And every time you work towards harmonization, you have to slowly pull those peculiarities or things that are unique to a province or territory out of the code and put it back to something national. So that will be a long, laborious process in Canada just to get everyone working on the same current code edition, which we hope will be the 2020 national codes, hopefully being adopted by each province, territory in the country prior to what is an intended publication of a 2025 National Building Code and National Fire Code of Canada. The other thing that differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is both the enforcement and the interpretation of those codes. Now, we have created in Canada a number of agencies to try and work towards harmonization. Codes Canada has the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes, which is a stakeholder representative organization that provides policy direction to Codes Canada in its work and for its volunteers who sit on those development committees. They have representatives from organizations such as what we call PITIPAP, or the Provincial and Territorial Policy Advisory Committee on Codes, which is a senior representative from each province or territory who provide guidance to, from a government policy perspective, all of those. So in essence, we have multiple players with multiple responsibilities in multiple jurisdictions. And the only thing that's going to get us to a harmonized code is to continue to talk at that national level, to collaborate with our peers and bring forward policies that are meeting the needs of all Canadians, or we will not ever get to what we can truly call a national code. Thank you.